He did what no one could have imagined. The dust was a constant companion, a fine red powder that settled on every surface, coated the back of the throat, and painted the evening sky in hues of bruised apricot and blood. Wyatt Caldwell tasted it on the wind, a gritty premonition of the ruin that seemed to creep closer with each passing season. The Caldwell Ranch, a sprawling legacy of sweat and toil, carved out of the unforgiving landscape by his father and his father before him, was dying a slow, parched death. The creek that had once bisected their northern pasture was now just a scar of cracked mud, and the cattle, ribs showing like the hoops of a barrel, wandered listlessly in search of sustenance that wasn't there. Every morning, Wyatt rode the fence lines, his shoulders tight with a tension that had become as much a part of him as his own shadow. The weight of it all, the relentless sun, the mounting bills stuffed into a drawer in his father's old desk, was a physical pressure in his chest. It was in the evenings that the pressure became unbearable, amplified by the soft, insistent murmur of his wife, Clara. She was beautiful, with hair the color of spun gold and eyes as blue and clear as a mountain lake. When he'd first brought her to the ranch, her laughter had seemed to fill the empty spaces of the old house, a promise of new life. But now her voice was a different instrument, one that played a melody of subtle discontent. They would sit at the heavy oak table for supper, the silence broken only by the clink of silverware, and Wyatt would feel her gaze on him, patient and probing. Opposite them, his mother, Beatrice Sutton, would eat with a quiet, almost unnerving stillness. She was a woman carved from the same tough timber as the land itself, her face a road map of her years, her hands gnarled but capable. She spoke little, her presence a silent, steady fixture in the house, like the stone hearth or the grandfather clock in the hall. "He's selling the Henderson place," Clara said one evening, her voice casual as she pushed a stray pea around her plate. The whole spread, moving to the city. Wyatt grunted, not looking up from his plate. He knew what she was doing. Henderson was another rancher grappling with the same drought, the same failing market. He said he couldn't carry the weight anymore. She continued, her voice dropping to a sympathetic whisper. "It's too much for one man, especially with extra burdens." Wyatt's jaw tightened. He knew the target of her words as surely as if she had pointed a finger across the table. He glanced at his mother. Beatrice seemed not to have heard, her attention fixed on her meal, but Wyatt saw the slight, almost imperceptible stiffening of her spine. She heard. She always heard. For months, Clara had been weaving this narrative, a tapestry of hints and sighs. It began with small things, a comment on how much food an extra mouth required, a sigh over the cost of Beatrice's tonics and medicines, a pointed remark about how Beatrice, in her old age, couldn't contribute to the heavy labor of the ranch the way a younger person could. Each word was a small, sharp stone dropped into the well of Wyatt's anxiety, and the ripples spread, distorting his perception. He loved his mother, but Clara's logic was a venom that worked its way into his blood. The ranch was failing, they were sinking. A man in a sinking boat had to shed unnecessary weight. "She doesn't do anything, Wyatt," Clara would whisper to him late at night, her warm body pressed against his back, her breath a sweet poison in his ear. "She just sits, she watches. It's another expense we can't afford. We have to think of our future, our family." He would try to defend her. "She's my mother, Clara. This is her home." "It was her home," Clara would correct gently. "With your father. But he's gone, Wyatt. It's our home now, and we're losing it. Is that what he would have wanted? For you to go down with the ship because you're too sentimental to make a hard choice?" The argument gnawed at him. He would lie awake, staring into the oppressive darkness, the numbers from the ledger scrolling behind his eyes, a litany of debt. He saw his father's face, stern and proud, and felt a hot spike of shame. Was he failing him? Was he letting the legacy slip through his fingers? The ranch was everything. It was his identity, his birthright, his entire world. The thought of losing it, of seeing it sold off piece by piece to strangers, was a terror that lived deep in his gut. Clara had given that terror a name and a face. It was the face of his own mother. He began to watch Beatrice through Clara's eyes. He saw not a matriarch, but a dependent. He saw her quiet dignity not as strength, but as a silent refusal to acknowledge their plight. Her small routines, tending her meager rose bushes by the porch, mending old linens with painstaking stitches, seemed like trivialities in the face of their looming financial apocalypse. The narrative took root. He began to believe it. The resentment, planted by Clara and watered by his own fear, began to grow, choking the love and duty that had been there before. The breaking point came on a Tuesday. A letter from the bank arrived, its language cold and final, speaking of foreclosure and deadlines. Wyatt read it 3 times, the words blurring as a cold sweat broke out on his brow. He felt a wave of nausea. This was it, the end of the line. He stumbled out of the office, the letter crumpled in his fist. Clara was in the kitchen, humming as she kneaded dough, a picture of domestic tranquility that felt like a cruel joke. She looked up, her eyes immediately finding the letter in his hand. Her humming stopped. "What is it?" she asked, her voice laced with a feigned innocence that grated on his raw nerves. He didn't answer, just smoothed the letter out on the flour-dusted countertop. She read it over his shoulder, her hand coming to rest on his arm. "Oh, Wyatt, I'm so sorry." His mother entered the kitchen from the back porch, carrying a small basket with a few withered-looking carrots. She placed it on the table and looked from the letter to Wyatt's pale face, then to Clara's carefully constructed mask of concern. "Bad news?" Beatrice asked, her voice even. It was Clara who answered. "The bank, Beatrice, they're calling in the loan. We don't have it." She looked at Wyatt, her blue eyes wide and pleading. "We have to do something. We have to cut our expenses, drastically, now." The air in the room was thick with unspoken meaning. Wyatt felt trapped, cornered by his wife's ambition, his mother's silence, and his own suffocating failure. He looked at Beatrice, at the woman who had raised him, who had taught him to ride and read, whose hands had soothed his fevers and bandaged his scrapes. And in that moment, poisoned by fear and resentment, he saw only the burden Clara had taught him to see. The words felt like ash in his mouth, but he forced them out. "Mother," he began, his voice hoarse. We need to talk." He led her into the parlor, the room they saved for important visitors. It smelled of dust and dried flowers. Clara followed, a silent vulture, and stood by the door. Beatrice sat in a high-backed armchair, her posture erect, her hands folded in her lap. She didn't look at him. She looked out the window at the brown, thirsty land. Wyatt stumbled through the speech he and Clara had rehearsed in hushed tones the night before. He spoke of the drought, the bank, the impossible numbers. He tried to soften the blow, using words like temporary and until we're back on our feet. He talked about her brother in the next state, a man with a comfortable business, suggesting she could stay with him for a while. Each word was a betrayal, a small death to his own soul. He felt hollowed out, a stranger in his own skin. He was a man throwing his own mother off the land her husband had built. When he finally fell silent, the quiet in the room was deafening. Beatrice still had not looked at him. She continued to gaze out the window, her expression unreadable. For a long, terrible moment, Wyatt thought she would not speak at all. Then she turned her head slowly, and her eyes, the same clear gray as a winter sky, met his. There was no anger in them. There was no pleading. There was only a vast, profound disappointment that was worse than any rage. It was a look that saw right through him, past the excuses and the weakness, to the frightened, foolish man he had become. "If that is your decision, Wyatt," she said, her voice low and steady, devoid of emotion, "then I will pack my things." She stood up, her movements deliberate and unhurried. She walked past him, past Clara, who stood frozen by the door with a flicker of triumph in her eyes, and went up the stairs to the room she had occupied for 40 years. Wyatt stood paralyzed in the parlor, the echo of her words ringing in his ears. He had done it. He had chosen. He felt a dizzying, sickening sense of relief, immediately followed by a wave of self-loathing so powerful it nearly brought him to his knees. He had saved his ranch. He had saved his future. But he had a chilling premonition that he had just lost something far more valuable. The next morning was cold and gray, the sky the color of lead. Beatrice came down the stairs carrying a single, worn leather suitcase. She was wearing her traveling coat and hat. She did not look at the house, at the furniture she had polished, the floors she had scrubbed, the walls that held the echoes of her life. She walked straight to the front door where Wyatt waited like a condemned man. The ranch hand, a young man named Dilly, was waiting outside with the wagon to take her to the train station in town. "I'll write," Wyatt said, the words sticking in his throat. Beatrice paused at the door and finally looked at him. "You do what you feel you must, Wyatt." He walked out the door without a backward glance. Wyatt watched from the porch as she climbed into the wagon. He watched as it trundled down the long drive, growing smaller and smaller until it was just a speck in the vast, indifferent landscape. Clara came and stood beside him, slipping her arm through his. "You did the right thing," she whispered, resting her head on his shoulder. "It was hard, but it was the only way. Now we can start to rebuild, just us." Wyatt didn't answer. He felt nothing. The crushing weight on his chest was gone, but it had been replaced by a chilling emptiness. He looked out at his land, the land he had just sold his soul to keep, and for the first time in his life, it looked like a foreign country. In the weeks that followed, a strange and unsettling quiet settled over the ranch house. The absence of Beatrice was a palpable presence, a void that seemed to suck the warmth from every room. Wyatt found himself listening for the soft tread of her footsteps on the stairs, or the quiet click of her knitting needles in the evening. There was a fragile sense of hope, a belief that now, with their greatest expense removed, things would begin to turn around. Clara was relentlessly cheerful, talking endlessly of the future, of the changes they would make, of the success that was now surely within their grasp. But the dust still blew, the creek bed remained dry, and the notices from creditors continued to appear in the mailbox with grim regularity. Wyatt's initial, hollow relief curdled into a nagging confusion. The numbers weren't adding up. He had expected a reprieve, a breathing space in their finances. Instead, the pressure seemed to intensify. The feed supplier, who had always been patient, was now demanding cash on delivery. The bank sent another letter, sharper this time, noting that the small, regular payments that had been keeping the account from total default had suddenly stopped. Wyatt was baffled. He had been making the main loan payments, struggling to do so, but he knew nothing of any smaller, regular payments. He assumed it was a banking error, another cross to bear. Clara, for her part, seemed to grow more restless. Her dreams for the ranch became grander, more expensive. She talked of buying new breeding stock they couldn't afford, of hiring more hands they couldn't pay, of renovating the house. Her desires were a stark contrast to the grim reality of their ledger. When Wyatt tried to inject a note of caution, she would grow petulant. But what was the point of it all then? She'd demand, her voice sharp. What was the point of that unpleasantness with your mother, if not to free us up to build something better? Are we just going to manage our decline, Wyatt? I thought you were a man of vision. Her words stung, striking at the heart of his insecurities. He began to avoid the ranch's office, the desk with its drawer full of debts. The shame of what he had done to his mother was a low, constant hum beneath the surface of his thoughts. He tried to justify it, to tell himself it was a necessary sacrifice, but the justification rang hollow. He had expected to feel like a commander who had made a tough but strategic decision. Instead, he felt like a coward. The unraveling began a month after Beatrice's departure. It came not with a bang, but with the arrival of a sleek black automobile that looked profoundly out of place, kicking up dust on the ranch road. A man in a dark city suit and polished shoes stepped out, carrying a leather briefcase. He introduced himself as Mr. Abernathy, an attorney from the state capital. "I'm here to speak with Mr. Wyatt Caldwell," he said, his tone polite but firm. "On behalf of my client, Mrs. Beatrice Sutton." Wyatt's blood ran cold. He led the man into the same parlor where he had condemned his mother. Clara hovered in the doorway, her eyes narrowed with suspicion. Mr. Abernathy opened his briefcase with methodical precision. "Mr. Caldwell," he began, "I am the executor of your late father's private estate. I believe there are some matters of which you have been kept unaware." He laid a document on the table. It was a copy of his father's last will and testament. Wyatt had seen the official will, the one that had left the ranch and its assets and its debts to him. This was something different, a private trust. Your father, a prudent man, knew the volatile nature of ranching, the lawyer explained. He did not want the family's entire security tied up in the land. Over the years, he made a series of very wise investments. He also, shortly before his passing, secured the full mineral rights to a section of land in the foothills, a section that, as I'm sure you're aware, has recently proven to be the site of one of the richest silver veins in the state. Wyatt stared at the lawyer, his mind struggling to process the words. Silver mine, investments, a fortune. It made no sense. This fortune and the income from the silver mine he left in a private trust, Mr. Abernathy continued, his voice impassive, the sole beneficiary and administrator of which was his wife, your mother, Beatrice. The room began to spin. Wyatt gripped the arms of his chair. "What are you talking about? We're nearly bankrupt." "No, Mr. Caldwell, you are not," the lawyer said calmly. "The ranch has indeed been operating at a loss for the past 3 years due to the drought. However, your mother has been covering all the shortfalls. She has been paying the suppliers, servicing the debt with the bank, those small, regular payments you likely knew nothing about, and ensuring the ranch remained solvent, all from her own funds, from the inheritance your father left her." Each word was a hammer blow, shattering the foundations of Wyatt's reality. He looked at the papers, at the columns of figures, the bank statements showing monthly transfers, the reports from the mining company detailing staggering profits. It was all there. A secret river of wealth had been flowing into the parched lands of the Caldwell Ranch, and he had never known. "Why?" Wyatt whispered, the word catching in his throat. "Why wouldn't she tell me?" Mr. Abernathy looked at him, and for the first time a flicker of something other than professional detachment crossed his face. It might have been pity. Because your father's trust came with a stipulation. He loved you, Mr. Caldwell, but he also knew your temperament. He worried you might be susceptible to poor judgment. The trust and the fortune was to pass to you upon your mother's death, but only if she deemed you worthy. She was instructed to test your character, to see if you were a man who valued family and loyalty above all else, to see if you were a man fit to be the steward of such a legacy. The full, horrifying weight of what he had done crashed down on Wyatt. The test. It had all been a test, and he had failed. He had failed in the most spectacular and shameful way imaginable. He had thrown away the woman who was secretly his savior, believing her to be a burden. He had cast out the keeper of his family's fortune at the urging of a woman who now stood in the doorway, her face ashen, her eyes wide with a dawning, greedy realization. "So the money," Clara breathed, stepping into the room. "The mine, it's ours now." Mr. Abernathy turned his cool gaze upon her. "Not exactly. According to the terms of the trust, in light of recent events, Mrs. Sutton has enacted a final clause. The inheritance and the ranch, which she now holds the controlling interest in as the primary creditor, will pass to Wyatt." He paused, letting the words hang in the air. "But a condition has been set. A choice must be made." The lawyer's eyes settled back on Wyatt, and they were as cold and hard as river stones. "Your mother has given you a choice, Mr. Caldwell. You are to send this woman," he said, gesturing dismissively toward Clara, "away, permanently. You are to remove her from this house and this family. If you do, the ranch is yours, the fortune is yours, and you will have the opportunity to reconcile with your mother. If you refuse, if you choose to stay with your wife, you will lose everything. The ranch will be sold, the trust will be dissolved, and its assets donated to charity, and you will be left with nothing but the consequences of your decisions." He closed his briefcase with a sharp snap that echoed the breaking of Wyatt's world. "You have 24 hours to decide. I will be at the hotel in town awaiting your answer." After the lawyer left, a suffocating silence filled the parlor. Wyatt could not look at Clara. He saw it all now with a clarity that was excruciating. He saw her months of manipulation, the subtle poisoning of his mind. He saw that her love was not for him, but for what he represented: status, land, and now a fortune she had never dreamed of. Her ambition had been a pickaxe chipping away at his honor, his duty, his love for his own mother. And he, blinded by fear and pride, had let her do it. He had been her willing tool. "Wyatt," Clara began, her voice trembling, trying to find the right note of persuasion. "Wyatt, darling, don't listen to him. It's a trick. She's a vindictive old woman trying to control you from afar. We can fight this. We have rights. That money is ours. It's your inheritance." He finally turned to look at her, and he felt as if he were seeing her for the first time. The beauty he had once admired now seemed brittle and grasping. The clear blue eyes were clouded with avarice. She saw a prize to be won, a legal battle to be fought. She didn't see the gaping wound she had carved into the heart of their family. She didn't understand the magnitude of his shame. "There is no we," Wyatt said, his voice flat and dead. "There is no ours. There is only what you have done, and what I have allowed you to do. But I did it for you, for us." She cried, taking a step toward him. "I wanted you to be strong, to take control of your own life." "You wanted my ranch," he said, the truth of it landing with the simple, heavy finality of a shovelful of dirt on a coffin. "You saw my mother as an obstacle to what you wanted, and you convinced me to remove her. You played on my fear, and you used it to turn me against my own blood." He walked past her, out of the parlor and into his father's office. He sat behind the desk, the throne from which he had made his disastrous pronouncements and buried his face in his hands. The choice Mr. Abernathy had presented was no choice at all. It was a lifeline. It was a path back from the abyss, a chance, however slim, to reclaim some piece of the man he was supposed to be. The thought of spending another day with Clara, of listening to her justifications, of seeing her face and being reminded of his own weakness, was unbearable. His love for her, which he had once thought was a great and towering thing, had been revealed as a shack built on sand, and the tide of truth had just washed it away completely. All that was left was the wreckage. He didn't sleep. He sat in the dark office, letting the full weight of his disgrace settle over him. He thought of his mother, of her quiet dignity as she'd left, of the disappointment in her eyes. That look was burned into his memory. He had broken her heart, and in doing so he had broken something fundamental in himself. The ranch, the money, the silver mine, they were secondary. What mattered was the chasm he had opened between himself and his mother. The choice was not between Clara and a fortune. It was between a life of lies and the possibility of redemption. The next morning he found Clara in their bedroom, frantically packing her bags. She turned on him, her face a mask of fury. "You're not going to do it, are you?" she spat. "You're going to let that old woman win. You're going to throw me out for her." "She is my mother," Wyatt said, his voice quiet but unyielding. "And this is her home. It was never yours to take." He arranged for Illy to take her to the station, a grim echo of his mother's departure. He gave her all the cash he had in the house, a gesture not of kindness but of finality. He wanted to sever the connection completely. He watched her go just as he had watched his mother go. But this time there was no emptiness, no self-loathing. There was only a profound and aching sorrow, and beneath it, a tiny, fragile seed of hope. He drove the old ranch truck into town himself and went straight to the hotel. He found Mr. Abernathy in the dining room, finishing his breakfast. "I've made my decision," Wyatt said, standing before the table. The lawyer simply nodded, wiped his mouth with a napkin, and waited. "Clara is gone," Wyatt said. "Tell my mother, tell her I've made my choice." Mr. Abernathy gave him a long, appraising look. "She is staying at the Miller house on the edge of town. She has been waiting for you." The drive to the Miller house was the longest of Wyatt's life. It was a respectable boarding house with a tidy garden. He saw her before she saw him. She was sitting on a bench on the front porch, reading a book. She looked smaller, more fragile than he remembered, but she was dressed in a fine dress and she looked peaceful. The sight of her, safe and comfortable, sent a fresh wave of shame through him. He had cast her out, imagining her destitute, while she had been living on her own terms, waiting to see what kind of man her son truly was. He walked up the path, his boots heavy on the gravel. She looked up as his shadow fell over her. Her face was calm, her gray eyes holding his. He stopped before her, his hat in his hands, unable to speak. All the words he had rehearsed, the apologies, the explanations, they all turned to dust in his mouth. He sank to his knees on the porch before her, his head bowed. "Mother," he choked out, the word a ragged sob. Can you ever forgive me?" He felt her hand, gnarled and warm, come to rest on his bowed head. It was the same hand that had comforted him as a child. "Your father wanted you to be a good man, Wyatt," Beatrice said, her voice soft but with an edge of steel forged in grief and disappointment. "More than he wanted you to be a rich one. He wanted you to understand that legacy isn't just land and silver. It's loyalty, it's honor, it's knowing what's worth fighting for and what must be protected at all costs." He looked up at her, his eyes blurred with tears. "I know that now. I was a fool, a blind, arrogant fool. I let fear and greed poison me. I failed you. I failed him. Beatrice looked away toward the distant hills that bordered their ranch. You did fail, Wyatt. You failed badly. But a man is not defined by his failures. He is defined by what he does after he has failed. You have made your choice. You have sent the poison away. That is a beginning. She stood up, pulling him to his feet. Now get up. There is work to be done. The ranch has been neglected. Our legacy is waiting. He stood beside her, a grown man, humbled and broken, yet feeling, for the first time in a long time, a sense of purpose. The road back would be long. Trust, once shattered, would need to be rebuilt piece by painful piece. But as he stood there, with the warmth of his mother's hand on his arm and the familiar silhouette of the hills on the horizon, he knew he was finally home. The dust of the ranch was still in the air, but for the first time it didn't taste like ruin. It tasted like a second chance.